This gallery represents a rich collection of Renaissance painting, sculpture, and music, which you may visit any time from the main entrance. Here, you can choose between the art gallery, with its collections of paintings and sculpture, the music gallery, with its concerts of Renaissance music, and the reference library, where you may find the sources used for this program. The main entrance leads you to this hall, where you may select any of 4 Italian schools, the early precursors of the 13th and 14th century, the first generation of Renaissance artists, the second generation, and finally, artists from the period known as the High Renaissance. Once you make your selection, you will see a brief introduction followed by a relief like this one. It represents all the artists contained in this part of the gallery. Here, you may join the guided tour and see all the works in chronological order, or you can visit the gallery on your own, choose an artist, and ask for a detailed explanation as you please. Whether you choose the guided tour or wish to visit the gallery on your own, you will have the opportunity to enjoy all the works at your leisure. You can pause at each artwork or each detail simply by pressing Action button 2 on your remote control. To continue, press the same button again. You can skip any program at any time by pressing Action button 1 on your remote control. The music gallery contains a number of concerts of Renaissance music. You may choose between choral music or instrumental music, or you may simply choose to hear all concerts. If you select choral music, you will be able to choose from a number of themes in Renaissance art. Then sit back and enjoy the music and the paintings as you please, without any voiceover or interruption. You may do the same if you choose any of the instrumental selections. Of course, you can always elect to hear all of the concerts simply by selecting Play All. Going back to the main entrance, you can also visit the reference library. This library contains a number of profiles on the composers whose music you hear throughout the program. As far as the arts are concerned, you will find in this reference library a number of sources which you may want to read yourself after watching this program. Finally, you may choose the Credits program, which contains a listing of the sources used to produce this disc. We hope that you will enjoy the Renaissance Gallery and revisit its many treasures time and time again. This library contains a number of profiles on the composers whose music you hear throughout the program. As far as the arts are concerned, you will find in this reference library a number of sources which you may want to read yourself after watching this program. The artists of Tuscany of the 15th century may have excelled in painting, sculpture, and architecture, but in the field of music, the Italians were overshadowed by the court of Burgundy. Like Florence, the Duchy of Burgundy enjoyed a tremendous outburst of creativity through the 15th century. The result was a generation of composers that include Gilles Binchois, Josquin des Prez, and Guillaume Dufay, whose fame spread throughout Europe and across the Alps. Soon, the wealth of Quattrocento Italy brought these musicians to Renaissance courts of Ferrara, Umbria, Venice, and Florence. It was Guillaume Dufay who would write the inaugural motet Super Rosarum Flores to celebrate the completion of the Florentine Duomo, while Josquin des Prez was the court composer of the Sforzas in Milan. In the following gallery, you may visit a number of concerts of original Renaissance music. the popular basse danse, favored as dance music by the general public, courtly gaillards, and ricercare, composed and performed for ladies and lovers at the court, and the monumental motetti, composed for chapels in Rome and Venice. Each concert is arranged around a key theme in the art of Renaissance Florence. This gallery is devoted to Italian artists who each influenced the birth of the Renaissance of Florence. You will be able to see the works individually and enjoy them at your own pace. Or you can choose the guided tour, which will take you along all the works in this gallery. Although the baptisterium in the center of Florence was built as early as the 7th century, it was not until the 1200s that work on the decoration was begun in earnest. First, the facade was covered with white and green marble from Prato. This form of decoration would be imitated all over Tuscany for many years to come. But the typical and unusual pyramid roof provided an ideal opportunity for a series of mosaics. These mosaics have been preserved to this day in remarkably good condition. The dominating feature is Christ overseeing the Last Judgment, a favorite theme of Byzantine mosaics. It is believed to be the work of the artist Coppo di Marcovaldo. There are a number of other mosaics in the dome, including scenes from the New Testament, which have sometimes been attributed to the painter known as the Maestro di Maddalena. These date from the later 13th century. The pulpit of the Cathedral of Siena is the work of Nicola Pisano, the most important precursor of Renaissance sculpture. Like Donatello and Ghiberti, Pisano studied Roman sculpture on sarcophagi and applied their style to his figures. Nicola completed the work in 1268, almost a century and a half before the beginning of the Renaissance. He was assisted by his son Giovanni and by a pupil, Arnolfo di Cambio, who would later become the most important Gothic architect of Florence. In his freestanding works, such as this graceful statue of the Virgin, Nicola Pisano demonstrates his interest in three-dimensional realism while remaining faithful to the Gothic tradition. In the treatment of the folds, there are numerous passages in which Nicola betrays his knowledge of Roman sculpture and its illusion of living form covered by cloth. But in the face of the Virgin, Nicola adheres to the tradition of the International Gothic style, an image of grace and love far removed from everyday realism. This panel by Giovanni de Paolo is one of the most intriguing of Italian Trecento art. Its dominating motif is the universe at left, represented by the 7 circles as described in Dante's Divina Commedia. To the right is the story of the expulsion from paradise. This theme provided one of the very few opportunities for the medieval artist to paint a human male and female in the nude. The Florentine painter Cimabue is often considered the artist who forged the transition from the Byzantine style to the art of Giotto, and with it, a new form of naturalism. In fact, he may have been Giotto's teacher. His altarpiece of the Madonna Enthroned of the late 13th century is a clear demonstration. The folds of Mary's robe and the position of the angels around her show little regard for an illusion of space. But in the treatment of the face, there is an indication of things to come, a new gentleness and grace that would be taken up by Giotto and Duccio. The attribution of some of the mosaics in the baptisterium to Cimabue is highly speculative. However, they demonstrate that even at this date, The art of mosaics was beginning to experience the changing styles with a new regard for realism and detail. Note, for example, the different expressions on the faces of the Magi who have embarked on their voyage, and the detailing of the ship itself. Giotto's frescoes of the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua are a turning point in the history of Italian art. The bonds with the Byzantine tradition have loosened, and for the first time, a painter sets out to develop new ideas and techniques of his own. The result is a series of discoveries that, although still marked by the Byzantine influence, point in the direction of the Renaissance. Giotto's interest in an illusion of space is the most obvious new element. He applies foreshortening, based on the fact that the human eye sees only part of a body when viewed at an angle. And in the treatment of surface textures like drapery, he rejects the stylized treatment of Byzantine art for a technique which imitates the interplay of light and shadow in the folds of clothing. The result is a spectacular new form of art, and one which propelled Giotto to fame all over Italy. In this panel, showing the nativity scene, Giotto continues his investigation of the illusion of space, and that of dramatic detail and realism. Among the daring new elements is the group of figures at the right. They have boldly turned their backs to us in order to worship the Virgin and Jesus. Giotto probably did this for two reasons. In this position, the group helps us to define the space and distance in this scene, while the men function at the same time as intermediaries, worshippers like us, in awe over what takes place in the stable. Also, note the detail of the stable itself, drawn without the benefit of Brunelleschi's laws of perspective, developed well over a century later. Giotto painted the fresco cycle about the life of St. John some 20 years after the Padua fresco style, and his art has undergone a new phase, what in German is often called an alter Stil. There is less daring, less novelty in these frescoes. Instead, the compositions are more restrained, graver, and endowed with a sense of monumentality. Still, Giotto keeps his unique eye for drama. He shows St. John just as he is about to touch the Father and angels in heaven. What's more, the temple structure around him presents a clear three-dimensional stage as bold as the stable of the Padua frescoes. The story of the resurrection of Drusiana by St. John is part of a collection known as the Apocrypha, pseudo-narratives which through the Middle Ages were added to the New Testament. However, to the 14th century Italian, they were very much a part of the Catholic drama. In this fresco, Giotto once more sets forth his later and mature style. The rich treatment of the figures in heavy folds and form, and the dramatic use of the buildings in the background to lend gravity and majesty to the scene. Like his contemporary Giotto, the painter Duccio from Siena made a successful break with the Byzantine style. But whereas Giotto turned to a highly personal exploration of new ideas, Duccio found inspiration in another source, the international Gothic style, which had spread through Europe from France and the Netherlands. Duccio's art found its zenith in the large altarpiece known as the Maestà, or Madonna Enthroned, painted between 1308 and 1311. Apart from the now familiar scene of the Madonna and Child Jesus on a richly decorated throne, it also contains a number of highly original panels with scenes from the New Testament which you will find in this gallery. To truly understand this new elegance and sweet grace so typical of Duccio's art, Compare this scene with the Madonna enthroned by Cimabue, painted only 20 years before in the Byzantine style. This panel on the Maestà altarpiece by Duccio shows Christ entering Jerusalem in triumph on Palm Sunday. What is remarkable about this work is two things. First, the glowing colors and rich detail of the figures, so warm and lifelike after the cold and gilded effigies of Byzantine art. Note the scene in which the people, overcome with enthusiasm, raid a local tree and toss the branches to the eager crowd below. And second, take a look at the buildings in the background. Of course, their perspective is not scientifically correct, since we are still 100 years away from Brunelleschi's discovery. But Duccio uses the buildings to provide keys to the story and strengthen the scene. The large triumphal arch shelters the populace and provides a focal point for Jesus and his party. At the same time, the central church building at left is our key to recognizing the great temple, and therefore placing the scene in Jerusalem. One of the many new elements that Duccio introduced in his panels of the Maestà altarpiece, including the Last Supper, was the idea to place figures fully enclosed by a room. In this, Duccio was even ahead of Giotto. Naturally, the perspective is based on intuition, not scientific laws, as is the case with French and Flemish Gothic paintings of the same period. But it is convincing nevertheless. And note how Duccio, always the gentle master, enlivens the scene with the figure of the young St. John, who is exhausted by the proceedings and has fallen asleep on the table. The Deposition of the Cross is probably the most moving and imaginative panel of Duccio's Maestà altarpiece cycle. It combines the traditional treatment of this scene in Byzantine art with a vivid sense of detail and compassion. The sky behind the crucified Christ is treated in Byzantine gold leaf, a reminder that a divine miracle has taken place. But in the moving passage of Mary holding the face of her dead son, we see a reflection of what would become one of the most favorite themes of post-Reformation art. The Pietà, the confrontation between the love of Mary and an evil, vengeful world. Also, note the detail of St. Peter gently removing the nails from the feet of the dead Christ. Welcome to this gallery of artists of the first Renaissance generation. You can choose to see each artist and his works individually at your leisure, or you can join a guided tour and see all the works in this gallery. Much has been written about the competition for the new doors of the Baptisterium in Florence of 1401, and how it was the talk of Tuscany at the time. But there can be no doubt that this was a turning point in the development of Western art. As we have seen in other galleries, Roman sculpture had been quoted before in Christian art, but never so openly and daringly as in the competitive designs of Brunelleschi and Ghiberti. Brunelleschi's key idea is one of dynamic movement, of violence. His thrust with the knife is abruptly intercepted by the strong arm of the angel who has swooped down from heaven to intercede. The young Isaac, nude, cringes in the imminent expectancy of death. A scene, in short, far removed from the austerity of Byzantine art or the graceful Gothic tradition. To hint at the source of his inspiration, Brunelleschi includes a small copy of a well-known sculpture of antiquity, the Spinario, the boy pulling a splinter from his foot. Despite the beauty of the work, The winner was Ghiberti, whose design is next. The first thing that strikes us when seeing Ghiberti's competitive design for the baptisterium doors is one of great technical expertise and competence. Although less ambitious in overall composition than that of Brunelleschi, Ghiberti is more successful in blending the many different elements together into one whole. Abraham and his son Isaac, the landscape elements, and the servants who take care of the horses that have brought the party so far into the desert. But take a closer look, and the genius of Ghiberti turns out to be no less daring than that of his Florentine colleague. For one, the nude Isaac is more beautifully crafted, and a blatant quote from one of many Roman sculptures of nude gods. This is a proud Isaac who has resigned himself to death. Abraham, too, has the air of a dignified Roman, copied perhaps from the statue of a Roman philosopher. And note the angel above, who we hope will intervene in time before the knife is thrust into the young body. Like Giotto's angel of some 100 years before, this figure is treated in dramatic foreshortening, thus creating a sense of space beyond the confines of this panel. When in 1402 the result of the baptisterium competition was announced, Ghiberti suddenly found himself the center of attention in Tuscany, and yet he was technically still a trainee in the workshop of his stepfather, a goldsmith. But in the more than 20 years that would follow, Ghiberti would prove himself a master in his own right and create beautiful panels like the St. Matthew, a work that combines Gothic grace with classical detail. Note the shallow relief in the garment of the angel. This technique will return in the early art of Donatello. The bronze doors of Ghiberti were a success, and even though they had cost over 22,000 florins, the Calimala Guild soon commissioned another set of doors for the baptisterium. These doors would become truly Ghiberti's masterpiece, testimony to his skill as a Renaissance designer and craftsman, as here in the panel of Moses on the mountain. It took Ghiberti more than 27 years to finish the new gilded panels, half of which was spent in the polishing and finishing of the fine detail in relief. For the design of the second doors, Ghiberti broke with the tradition that had been set by Andrea Pisano in the original baptisterium doors a century ago. Instead of nestling his figures in the Gothic quatrefoil, a symbol as old as Florence itself, Ghiberti now gave his figures the wide and unlimited space of a large square. What's more, there is a new painterly quality to his panels, a quest for the same illusion of space and perspective that was sought after by his contemporaries Uccello, Lippi, and Botticelli. Proud of his work, Ghiberti included a self-portrait in one of the tondi that straddle the panels, a man whose immortality was sealed by Michelangelo himself when he pronounced the gilded panels of the baptisterium to be the gates of paradise. The church of Santa Maria del Carmine was located in one of the poorer districts of Florence, and when Cosimo moved for a general tax law in 1427, it fell particularly heavy on the people of this parish. Perhaps this event inspired the subject of this fresco, where Jesus tells Peter to pay the tax collector with a coin brought ashore by a fish. In fact, Masaccio may have used these very parishioners as models, strong, simple laborers and workmen, filled with anxiety and uncompromising devotion, as the apostles themselves once were. In terms of style, however, this painting has no precedent. In every scene, in every detail is a new idea, a new invention. The building at right is probably the first instance when Brunelleschi's new law of perspective was tried out in a fresco painting. The massive robes and heavy folds indicate a self-confidence in Masaccio that is far removed from the Gothic tradition, and in fact reaches back to the early days of Giotto. And the faces themselves, poised, intent, determined, communicate for the first time that precious ideal of the Renaissance, that of character, of man as an individual in charge of his destiny. In this fresco, which borders the tribute money, Masaccio moved to introduce another new idea, to represent Adam and Eve not as victims of shame, but as human beings with a physical beauty that truly identifies them as the first couple on earth, capable of love as well as pain and grief. The delicate treatment of the human body, and its suggestion of bone and living skin, was unprecedented, and comparable only to the nude sculpture of David by Donatello, which would be completed shortly thereafter. This fresco was one of the last that Masaccio painted for the Brancacci family, in their chapel of Santa Maria del Carmine. While at work on this fresco, he had completed most of the right side of the picture. Masaccio died at the very early age of 27. The paintings were left unfinished, and soon thereafter, the Brancacci family was expelled into exile. Not until some 50 years later was Filippino Lippi asked to complete the left side of the fresco. The fresco relates the miracle of Antioch, in which St. Peter raised the son of King Theophilus from the dead. The figure of the tyrant Theophilus is believed to be a likeness of Gian Galeazzo Visconti, the nemesis of Florence in the wars with Milan. Below him is the figure of Coluccio Salutati, Chancellor of Florence at the time. It was Salutati who provided Florence with its moral mission, to become a new center of freedom and the arts, based on the example set by Republican Rome. Donatello was 8 years younger than Ghiberti when he joined his workshop, as most other noted Florentine sculptors would do. And it was Ghiberti who taught Donatello the importance of grace and detail, just as Nanni di Banco shortly thereafter would expose the young sculptor to the grave dignity of sculpture inspired by classical examples. The result is an art that is uniquely Donatello, one which blends classical gravity and dignity with the elegance of the early Renaissance. It appears for the first time in this figure of St. Mark, which was commissioned in 1411 by the Guild of the Linen Merchants. It still stands today in its original niche in the church of Or San Michele. 5 years after completing the St. Mark, Donatello could create his St. George. It was also destined for the O San Michele façade, but this time commissioned by the Arte dei Corazzi, the Guild of Sword Makers, for whom St. George was a patron saint. Where St. Mark had been the image of dignity, this St. George embodied a new sense of the heroic, a soldier of Christ whose mind and gaze is preoccupied with something far beyond our perception. In the predella beneath the sculpture, Donatello introduced another new concept, that of the shallow relief, or relievo schiacciato, an art form that permitted subtle nuance in shading and delicate lines like the panels of Ghiberti. The young David is beyond question Donatello's most daring and most classical statue. The composition in which the weight of the body is carried by one leg, with the other held in balance, is inspired by the classical position known as contrapposto, first introduced by the Greek sculptor Praxiteles. But David is no mere imitation. Its youthful detail and delicate features are those of the Italian Renaissance, and bears witness to the frescoes of Masaccio. Completed in 1433, the David was prominently displayed in the Palace of the Medici until their expulsion in 1495. The Annunciation was completed in 1435, shortly after Donatello returned from a second visit to Rome to study ancient sculpture. This delicate work marks the beginning of a second phase in the life of Donatello, a very prolific one in which the influence of ancient Rome is gradually absorbed in a far more dramatic and highly personal style. As a result, this elegant altarpiece is a work in transition. The rich gilding on stone and the serene spirit are those of the early Renaissance, while the shock and anticipation in the face of young Mary indicate new things to come. In 1443, Donatello was invited to Padua to work on the altar of Il Santo, the Church of St. Anthony. At around the same time, he received the commission to create an equestrian statue of Erasmo di Nani, a heroic condottiere who went by the nickname of Gatta Melata. It was the first time that an Italian sculptor would revisit the typical Roman motif of the victor on horseback. The powerful composition, with its lifelike image of the proud commander, would become a prototype for many statues to follow, including the Colleoni monument by Verrocchio, elsewhere in this gallery. But the image of the horse, poised and graceful, would be even more enduring, particularly for artists like Da Vinci, who would study the subject of a horse in great detail. As a boy of 8, Filippo Lippi had been sent to the monastery of the Carmine, but his love for pretty women and admiration for the frescoes which Masaccio was painting there made him abandon his vocation, and he became a painter. In 1455, he painted this lovely portrait of the Madonna with Child and angels, perhaps one of the most famous works of the early Renaissance. Although it may lack the drive for innovation and experimentation that motivated other artists, the panel excels in grace and sweetness. It was probably painted for Lippi's mentor, Cosimo de' Medici, who more than once had to pardon him for his many affairs around town. This mysterious portrait, now in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum in New York, was probably commissioned at the occasion of a wedding. The rather strange setting serves mainly to demonstrate the painter's skill with the laws of perspective. By virtue of the coat of arms, the sitters have been identified as Lorenzo de Ranieri Scolari and his wife Agnola. Note the extreme care for detail in the cloth and texture, no doubt inspired by Flemish paintings, which were becoming popular in Italy at the time. Of all the Renaissance sculptors at work in the first half of the Quattrocento, the 15th century, few had studied and absorbed Roman sculpture as thoroughly as Nanni di Banco, who was born in Florence between 1380 and 1390 and died in 1421. This is di Banco's first large piece, the Four Crowned Saints, in one of the alcoves in the church of Orsan Michele. What is most surprising is the early date. The work was begun in 1410, only 8 years after the Baptisterium competition, 1 year before Donatello made his St. Mark. Although these proud men lack the inner spirit and majesty of Donatello, their execution betrays a deep and almost academic knowledge of Roman portraiture. Nanni's young talent was acknowledged soon enough, and he was charged with the execution of a number of sculptures for the Cathedral of Florence itself. This is one of the figures, representing St. Luke. Once again, we are impressed how this very young sculptor, barely in his 20s, has grasped the essence of Roman sculpture, with its generous use of mass and folds, and the grave features of the evangelist. We would almost forget that this is a clear interpretation of Roman imperial portrait busts, possibly that of Marcus Aurelius. Like Masaccio, Nanni died too young to have found enduring fame on a par with a Ghiberti or Donatello, but his influence on this generation was unmistakable. Welcome to this gallery of artists of the second Renaissance generation. You can choose to see each work individually with a brief explanation, or you can join a guided tour and see all the works in this gallery. Paolo Uccello, who was born in 1397, worked like so many other artists of his generation in the workshop of Ghiberti before moving to Venice in 1425. Shortly after his return in 1430, the Florentine army had one of its periodic clashes with Florence's chief rival, the city of Siena, in the hills of San Remo. Florence won, and some years later Uccello was asked to depict the battle for the Palazzo Medici. The panel shows the battle at its climax. The ranks of the Florentines had left are suddenly aided by the arrival of troops under Condottieri Micheletto. The Sienese commander Bernardino is struck and thrown off his magnificent white horse. In panic, the Sienese cavalry turns and flees from the scene. The ambitious work gave Uccello ample opportunity to study the effects of perspective in a non-architectural setting. Florence owed its survival in the war with Milan not only to the stamina of its citizens, but also to the battle tactics of its army commander, John Hawkwood. Like most condottieri, Hawkwood was a mercenary. Today, we would call him a military advisor. Florence had pledged to honor the commander with an equestrian statue, but money was scarce, and the liberal mood in Florence ran counter to building a monument so glorious for a stranger, no less. As a result, a compromise was reached, and Uccello was commissioned to make a painting of the commander on horseback in the Duomo. The rather unusual subject once again challenged Uccello to experiment with his beloved laws of perspective. The fresco would be of some influence on Donatello when he created his Gattamelata monument in Padua. Giovanni Bellini was not a Florentine. For most of his life, he worked in and around Venice, but his art and influence rank him as one of the foremost painters of the second Renaissance generation. Born in 1430, he would live to 1516 and have a powerful influence on artists of the High Renaissance, including Titian and Veronese. This beautiful portrait of Mary and Child, painted in the 1480s, sums up his style: sensuous, rich in tone, exquisite. Instead of line and drawing, Bellini and other Venetian artists would stress color, shading, and tone. Light effects, in short, which evoke the wealth of the Venetian Republic and the unique interplay of light and reflection in the canals of the city. This is one of the most mysterious works of the Renaissance, and probably depicts, like the Primavera by Botticelli in this gallery, the conflict between Christian tradition and Roman philosophy. It was an old conflict that would preoccupy much of the Quattrocento and would appear again in the Stanze of Raphael. In principle, the painting follows the motif of the Sacra Conversazione: Christ, Mary, and saints brought together by communion in prayer. But that does not explain the rather exotic location, the elaborate terrace and other figures who seem to be observers rather than participants. If anything, it underscores Bellini's great respect for his brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna, who worked in and around Mantua. The fine detail and rich color of this painting, the circumcision in the temple, seems to share some affinity with this allegorical mystery. The sculptor Luca della Robbia is one of many Quattrocento artists who bridge both generations and continued to have a major influence through the end of the century. In 1431, he was commissioned to erect a cantoria, or gallery for singers, over the entrance of the north sacristy of the Duomo. the cathedral. Completed in 1438, the work marked Della Robbia as a sculptor equal to a Donatello or Ghiberti. Executed in shallow relief, the figures of the young singers and musicians have a fresh and realistic quality, despite their obviously classical treatment. It is almost as if Della Robbia had been whisked away to the days of Rome and studied children in their play on the Forum. Surprisingly enough, it is also Luca's only major work in marble. Soon, he began to experiment with a new form of material, more manageable and less expensive than marble, with which to continue his artistic career. The new material that Luca was looking for to better express his love for youth and beauty was terracotta clay, but coated in a special new glaze that made it look like marble. This Madonna with Child holding a scroll, now in the New York Metropolitan Museum, is a good example. It dates from 1455. The white enamel of the terracotta glaze has been lightly touched up with blue. The scroll reads, Ego sum lux mundi, I am the light of the world. Based on this technique, the Della Robbia workshop could produce a great number of such pieces, for which an eager market existed among the less wealthy village churches of Italy and beyond. When the Italian writer Giorgio Vasari criticized the dry and predictable style of this painting by Verrocchio, compared to the angel at the far left by Leonardo, he was not altogether fair. For one, Verrocchio, here in a portrait by Lorenzo di Credi, was a very skilled and versatile artist, whose best medium was undoubtedly sculpture. What's more, the Baptism of Christ, which was painted between 1470 and 1475, is really a workshop piece of sorts, and several pupils may have had a hand in it. Nevertheless, the figure of the angel is, as Vasari wrote, clearly the work of a different talent, drawn with a skill and sweetness that would presage Da Vinci's first major work, The Annunciation, elsewhere in this gallery. Verrocchio was a versatile artist, but he excelled at sculpture. His moment came when the Venetian army commander, Bartolomeo Colleoni, died, leaving a large legacy for the purpose of having a memorial built in his honor. Like the Gattamelata by Donatello in nearby Padua, it was to become a crowning monument for Verrocchio's art. Clearly, Donatello's example had its influence. But whereas Donatello's mount is an image of dignity, the Colleoni is a vision of almost intimidating power. As an indication of things to come, the commander restrains his powerful horse and casts an almost arrogant look at the Venetians below him. It is 1488, and war, the raw use of power, is once again in the air. Like Luca della Robbia and Filippo Lippi, Piero della Francesca was a product of the first generation of the Renaissance, whose art and influence continued through the end of the Quattrocento. But he was not originally from Florence. He was born in a small village, Borgo San Sepolcro, between 1410 and 1420, and died there in 1492, after a long and important career. In 1452, Della Francesca was commissioned to begin his masterpiece, the frescoes of the Legend of the Cross in the choir of the San Francesco in Arezzo. The project would involve him for 7 years. Like Masaccio, Piero sought to understand the effect of perspective on the human body, and went to great lengths to study it on models. The result is different from Masaccio's, whose figures live and breathe. Piero's figures are, by contrast, living sculptures frozen in a pose of grandeur. The two portraits of the rulers of Urbino, painted by Piero della Francesca in 1465, are often used and admired as typical of the age of the Renaissance ruler. It shows us Federico II of Montefeltro, Duke of Urbino, and his wife, Battista Sforza. What strikes us is the rather strange decision to paint the Duke in profile. The reason is simple. The Duke had lost his other eye. What's more, the idea of a profile portrait had its classical origins in the form of coins. The result is an impression of austere beauty, typical for the art of Piero, which, despite the yellowing effect of old varnish, persists to this day. Sandro Botticelli ranks without question as the leading painter of the second generation, the last great painter of Quattrocento Florence before the advent of Da Vinci and Michelangelo. He was born in Florence in 1445 and grew up in the workshop of Filippo Lippi. This portrait of a young man with a medal was painted in 1470, when Botticelli was 25 years old. The sitter is obviously on close terms with the House of the Medici, for he holds a medal with the portrait of Cosimo de' Medici, Pater Patriae, the elder Chancellor of Florence. Recent investigations point to the possibility that this is a self-portrait, painted at a time when Botticelli was eager for the patronage of the Medici house, a quest in which he was ultimately successful. Of all the secular paintings made in Florence through the century, this is by far the most mysterious and beautiful. Many different explanations have been offered, but most studies seem to agree that what we are witnessing here is the merger of two ideas: classical mythology and philosophy, and the tradition of Christianity. Much of this was inspired by the so-called Neoplatonic school, centered around the scholar Marsilio Ficino. Ficino, who held great influence over Lorenzo de' Medici and his circle, held that both classical mythology and Christianity had a common purpose: to unlock and understand the divine principles of the universe and their manifestation in nature around us. When seen in this context, the purpose of this allegory becomes clear. At right, the wind god Zephyr and the nymph Chloris bring flowers to the world, brought forth by spring or Primavera herself. In this new world of beauty and grace, Venus, painted as a Madonna, gives the gift of life, and man continues the cycle through its development of the arts, symbolized by the three graces. Finally, it is through the arts that, like Mercury at left, we can poke through the mist of everyday life and glimpse the eternal truth of the universe. The Primavera was unquestionably Botticelli's most ambitious work. It was completed in 1478 and hung in the Villa di Castello, owned by a cousin of Lorenzo de' Medici. This panel was completed shortly after the Primavera in 1480, on commission for the Lama family and their chapel in the Santa Maria Nuova. In fact, it depicts members of the Medici family paying tribute to the newborn child. There is Cosimo the Elder, his son Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo de' Medici, and at far right, Giuliano de' Medici. This magnificent painting, through which Botticelli's fame endures to this day, was like the Primavera commissioned for the Villa di Castello, and ultimately hung in the same room. Begun in 1480, Botticelli completed it in 1485. By tradition, it depicts the birth of the goddess of love, Venus, from the foam of the sea, after which she was carried to land on a giant shell. It is a virtuoso piece, not only in the beautiful figure of the nude Venus, but also in the rich and luxurious treatment of the cape and the flowing garments of the gods themselves. We almost believe we are looking at a rich tapestry in which the primary concern is not for space or three-dimensional illusion, but for the soft lines and textures of the newly discovered human body. Welcome to this gallery of artists of the High Renaissance generation. You may join the guided tour or see each work individually and ask for explanation as you please. The Annunciation is the first large work by the young Leonardo da Vinci, painted when he was 20 years old in 1472. For a long time, the panel was thought to be the work of either Ghirlandaio or Verrocchio, and it was only ascribed to Leonardo in 1869. Clearly, it is a youthful work and overly ambitious. The table in front of the Madonna is not very convincing, and the fading landscape fails to strike a balance with the imposing wall at right. But when we look closely and see the folds of her garment, the delicate tracing of the angel, or the young sweetness of Mary herself, we see the hand of a master who has set out gingerly to mark his career. The portrait of Ginevra de' Benci is one of Leonardo's first portraits. It was painted in 1474, 2 years after the Annunciation, and although the treatment of the young face follows the style of the Madonna he had just finished, we feel that Leonardo is probing, in search of what goes on behind those eyes and what spirit lies dormant in the sitter. It is this quest that would ultimately produce the Mona Lisa, as we shall see. The Adoration of the Magi was begun in 1480, based on a commission by the monks of San Donato, and Da Vinci has obviously matured. In fact, he had become such a perfectionist that each new work of his hands must be a statement in itself, each panel a dramatic new way of redefining nature and the thematic subject matter it is meant to depict. His hands could not possibly execute the visions of his imagination, laments Vasari, and nowhere is this more evident than in this large and unfinished panel. The key theme is the birth of Christ as a shining light of peace and love, surrounded by the wonder and doubt of a world in turmoil. This is the meaning of the different figures, arranged in an arc around the Madonna, each a new and original study in the human figure, in expression, in gesture. In the background, time goes on, seemingly oblivious of what is taking place. Temples are built, wars are fought. Finally, the whole scene is anchored on either side by two extremes of human response to Christ. The old man at left is lost in deep thought, but the gaze of the young, impetuous man at right is held by more exciting things taking place elsewhere. Perhaps typically, this young man at right is quite possibly a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. The Last Supper is often considered the work that, like Michelangelo's David and the Pietà, seals the era of the 15th century and opens up the art of the High Renaissance. This fresco in the refectory of the Santa Maria delle Grazie is obviously in poor condition. In fact, it started to blister even while Da Vinci was still applying the last coat of paint. But we still see and feel the power of this work. Christ has just announced that one of the apostles at the table will betray him within hours. Shocked, the apostles veer back, some defensive, some incredulous, some full of resignation. But despite this sense of agitation, the scene retains its harmony, held in check by the simple but majestic room and its confident projection into space. The focal point of its perspective lies behind the head of Christ. What Da Vinci was seeking to illustrate in the Adoration of the Magi, a nucleus of worldly tension around the spiritual calm of Christ, he accomplished on this battered wall in a cloister in Milan. In many ways, The portrait of La Gioconda of 1503 sums up much of what Da Vinci has sought and achieved in the preceding 30 years since that first Madonna on a terrace painted in 1472. He has mastered the art of sfumato, of unifying the three-dimensional illusion of a painted figure with space and distance behind it by virtue of a fine haze, an atmosphere. The anatomical details carry few secrets. The hands are drawn with confidence. The folds are suggested with little effort. What preoccupies the painter, however, is the soul of this woman, her thoughts, her moods. For the more than 4 years that he would work at it, he would stand and gaze, spellbound at this beautiful face, waiting and hoping that at last the eternal mystery of the woman was finally captured and held by man. The Pietà, although a work by a youthful sculptor, bears witness to a talent and experience seldom found in the hands of a 24-year-old. The Pietà was a favorite theme through the Middle Ages. It often depicted Mary in dramatic gestures of grief, horrified by the mutilated body of her dead son. But this Mary does not speak. She does not cry. She simply cradles her son in her arms, so lifelike that perhaps the heart has not altogether stopped, and, overcome with grief, raises her left hand in silent accusation at the world. Michelangelo was a famous sculptor almost overnight, secured by the fact that when some could not believe it was his work, he signed his name across the sash of Mary's robe. 2 years after the Pietà, Michelangelo was commissioned to create a sculpture of David after his victory over Goliath, a favorite theme in the history of Florence. But this is a different David, far removed from the youthful and elegant boy of Donatello, a work of the early Renaissance. This is a proud David who has long since discarded the head of Goliath and now, filled with ambition and self-confidence, looks ahead to his next challenge. This is altogether a new age, an age of wars, tyrants, and heroes. The liberal peace of Florence and its age of elegance is but a distant memory. David, and his pose of barely controlled strength, is a sign of times to come. The immediate cause for building the tombs was the recent deaths of 2 Medici dukes, the Duke Giuliano de' Medici of Nemours in 1516, and Duke Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, in 1519. This, and the fact that even Lorenzo the Magnificent still had no proper burial chamber, impelled Pope Leo X, himself a member of the Medici family, to send Michelangelo back to Florence to create the tombs for all 3. The figure of the deceased duke is allegorical. In real life, he bore little resemblance to this strong and handsome soldier, an echo of David. But the real meaning of the monument emanates from the figure of Night, her muscular body surrendered to a deep sleep. Caro mi il sonno, Michelangelo wrote. How dear it is to be but a block of stone, when all about is shame and war and woe. The Sistine Chapel frescoes are a hallmark of the High Renaissance period. Begun around 1509, Michelangelo created an anthology of Renaissance art, a source of figures, poses, expressions, and composition from which painters would draw until well into the 19th century. The original chapel had been built by the uncle of Pope Julius II, and it forced Michelangelo to abandon work on the magnificent tomb he was building for Pope Julius, a work which he himself thought would become his masterpiece. As a result, Michelangelo, never an artist to favor painting, took to the task of covering the vast ceiling with frescoes with some reluctance, and finished it single-handedly in record time, in less than 4 years. We will return to the frescoes of the Sistine Chapel during one of the concerts in the music gallery. This early work by Raphael, commissioned while he was still in the workshop of Perugino, was commissioned for the Albizzini family, who wanted to place it in their family chapel in the church of San Francesco. It is signed and dated Raphael Urbinus, 1504. The dominant motif of the painting is one of symmetry and balance, defined by the central building in the top half of the picture, a concept that has its origin in several works by Perugino, including the Handing of the Keys to St. Peter. In this arrangement, Mary and her ladies-in-waiting are at left, whereas Joseph and the other previous suitors are at right. The building itself is noteworthy because it betrays Raphael's interest in and obvious familiarity with Renaissance architecture. It certainly is superior to the Temple of Perugino, which is little more than an architectural fantasy. The idea of a centralized church had been a key preoccupation for many Renaissance architects and artists, not only Alberti, but also Da Vinci, and ultimately Bramante, who would apply the idea to several churches, including his design for St. Peter's in Rome. This panel, often known as the Colonna altarpiece, was painted barely a year after the betrothal of the Virgin, but Raphael's art is obviously experiencing a major transformation. He has been to Florence and has studied the art of Masaccio, Lippi, and Da Vinci. The overall composition is faithful to the early Renaissance model, which in itself was a three-dimensional update of the Byzantine Madonna in Majesty motif. But look at the solid forms of Peter at left, or the intent gaze of St. Paul at right, and we're beginning to see a glimpse of the mature Raphael, which was to assert itself in the frescoes of the Stanze in Rome, which are next in this gallery. The Disputa is one of the first set of Raphael frescoes which were commissioned by Pope Julius II in the private apartments or stanze in the Vatican shortly after 1508. They rank as the mature masterworks by the painter when he was barely 26 years old. The key idea behind the early stanze frescoes is the reconciliation of Christian with classical values, a fundamental problem throughout the era of the Renaissance. It is embodied in the three themes that are presented in these works, and in fact may have been suggested by Julius II himself. They are beauty in the classic sense, as defined by the Muses, truth, as pursued by philosophers throughout the ages, and faith, as the central core of the Christian tradition. The title of Disputa suggests not a dispute, but a confirmation of some kind, proof by all the historical figures presented in this fresco to the validity of Christendom and its central organization in the Church. There we see, for example, in the upper region, the figures of St. Peter, Adam, St. John the Evangelist, David, and in the lower region, the early Church Fathers and Popes, including St. Gregory, and lastly, Sixtus IV, who was uncle of Julius II and who had been responsible for consolidating the power of the Vatican in Rome once more. The idea of a summit of saints and leading historical figures around the figure of Christ would continue to become a favorite theme in the High Baroque. The second fresco of the Stanze, known as the School of Athens, strikes us first of all for its ambitious composition. To convincingly distribute the many different figures over the large wall, Raphael places the whole scene in a vast structure. In it, we recognize the inspiration of Raphael's new mentor in Rome, the architect Bramante, who was partly responsible for getting Raphael the assignment in the first place. Raphael, in fact, included a tribute to his older friend in the figure of Euclid. Indeed, this massive building is nothing but a projection of the future St. Peter's Basilica itself, or at least in the way Bramante imagined it. The theme of this fresco is the search for truth by philosophers through the ages, embodied in the title of the School of Athens, The central figure clearly is Plato, in the guise of Leonardo da Vinci, who points his finger upward, a mystical gesture that often appeared in the works of da Vinci himself, and hints at the Neoplatonic philosophy of Ficino. Aristotle at right points at us, effectively summarizing the tenets of the opposite schools of thought. Raphael included a number of other figures, and Vasari helped us identify them. There is, for example, Michelangelo, a stunning figure in white who is sometimes identified as Francesco Maria della Rovere, a cousin of the Pope. And finally, young Raphael himself, looking directly at us. The older man to the right may be his old master from Urbino, the painter Perugino. To convey the third theme of the stanze, that of beauty, Raphael conceived of a more intimate composition inspired by the mythological idea of Parnassus. Surrounded by the 9 muses and the leading poets and scholars that they inspired, Apollo reigns triumphant, playing the violin. To his left is Calliope, balanced at his right by Erato, holding a classical lyre. Again, we recognize some well-known actors in this drama: Dante, Homer and Virgil, Boccaccio, Ariosto, and Petrarch. Once again, Raphael may have included a self-portrait, since he himself felt something of a poet, placed directly behind the figure of Virgil. The Triumph of Galatea was painted in 1512 for the banker Agostino Chigi from Siena, who had a new villa built in the Trastevere section, known as the Villa Farnesina. With the image of the goddess Galatea on a shell, Raphael pays homage to the Venus of Botticelli. But compare the two, and Botticelli's work looks almost medieval with its emphasis on decorative lines and two-dimensionality. Galatea, on the other hand, is a figure of a new age at the center of swirling action, almost an instance of early Baroque. This fresco forms part of the second series of frescoes which Raphael painted in the Stanze in 1512. It depicts a miracle transformation from a 13th century legend. The chief protagonist bears the features of Julius II himself. The detail of the Swiss soldiers at the lower right is particularly interesting for 2 reasons. One, it was Julius II who instituted the tradition of the Swiss Guards, charged with the security and defense of the Vatican, a tradition that continues to this day. And second, because the portraits are unusually realistic. With their bright colors and bold form, they may reflect an influence from Venetian painting at the time. While Michelangelo and Raphael continued the Renaissance tradition in Rome, one painter brought it to unprecedented heights in Venice, the artist Titian, who was born in or around 1490. Like Raphael, he absorbed what the previous generation had accomplished, in this case the early Venetian school of Bellini, Giorgione, and Palma Vecchio, and fused it into a highly personal art that would reign until the 70s, long after the high Renaissance had passed. This is the Venus of Urbino, so named because Vasari saw it there and described it as a young Venus on her bed, surrounded by flowers and delicate drapery. It was originally commissioned by Guido Baldo della Rovere, the Duke of Camerino, in 1538. The sensuous and dreamlike mood of the young goddess is offset by the businesslike demeanor of her servants as they search through the cassone in the back of the room. This is a portrait of the noted humanist and poet Pietro Aretino, painted in 1545 and sent by Aretino as a gift to Duke Cosimo I of Florence. The portrait is an early example of the late phase of Titian's art. in which the sensuous and languid air of mythological scenes was gradually replaced by a new inner anxiety, a quickening of the brushwork and impatience with detail. In this case, it serves to accentuate the inner mood of the sitter and instill a sense of dynamic creativity that is barely contained. Born in 1445, Josquin des Près was, after Guillaume du Fay, perhaps the most influential and senior composer to bring the courtly style of Burgundy to Italy. Little is known about him, except that his works continued to be published and performed until the 17th century, long after the names of Banchois and Dunstable had been forgotten. Des Près was essentially a synthesist, a man who understood the unique elements of the Burgundy style and painstakingly crafted them together to produce works of great intricacy and sophistication. Note how in this work, a Spagna dance, the first theme is taken up, elaborated upon, and refined by each instrument section on its own terms, almost as if we were already hearing that great Baroque invention of the fugue. After a rich and rewarding career at the courts of Milan, Rome, Ferrara, and Paris, Josquin retired to Flanders and died there in 1521. The name of the great composer, Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, who lived from 1525 to 1594, is almost synonymous with the Roman school of music. Palestrina wrote little instrumental music and instead concentrated on perfecting the art of a cappella music, choir music sung in the papal chapels without the benefit of instrumental support. Like the architecture of the Renaissance, this motet is a historical adaptation. Known as Alma Redemptoris Mater, or Loving Mother of the Redeemer, it is actually a careful transcription of a 13th century Gregorian chant. Palestrina gives the key to this in the opening passage. First, we hear the original version, treated in typical Gregorian monophonic style. And then, the choir joins in and raises the theme to the full polyphonic counterpoint of the 16th century. Throughout 15th century Italy, the lute rapidly became one of the most popular instruments for a range of themes. And no wonder. The new love of delicate movement and contrapuntal balance in the music of this time was perfectly suited for the warm harmony of the lute, not unlike the careful proportioning of perspective and tone in paintings of the period. Typical of this music is the collection of Ricercare by Francesco da Milano, who lived from 1497 to 1543 and was called Il Divino, the Divine, by his admiring audience. A ricercare was so called because of its free improvisational style, which allowed both the composer and the musician to explore the full range of contrapuntal possibilities. In 1589, the court of Ferdinand de' Medici asked the composer Emilio di Cavalieri to write a theme for the Duke's wedding to Cristiana de Loreno. The resulting Aria del Granduca became an immediate success and was played in countless variations at courts all over Europe. What's more, the tune was so dear to Florentines that they adopted it as the official song of the city. Some transcriptions even refer to it as the Aria di Firenze. In one treatment, the aria is adapted in the style of a basse danse, a popular dance form also known as the Spagna. When couples danced outside, as shown on this Cassone painting of a wedding, musicians would often use what the Flemish called haut instrument, a shawm, trombone, recorders, and drum. Like Michelangelo, the Venetian composer Giovanni Gabrieli, who lived from 1557 to 1612, is often seen as a precursor of the High Baroque. Both initiated a sense of monumentality that the art of the Counter-Reformation would need and absorb as its own. Unlike his Roman contemporary Palestrina, Giovanni Gabrieli loved to indulge in rich polyphonic textures and chromatic development. His chorales are often scored for the accompaniment of organ, brass, or both, qualities that are not unlike the sensuous art of Paolo Veronese and Tizian. To heighten the dramatic effect, Gabrieli often divided his choirs in groups of high, middle, and low voices, and spread them around on the many balconies of St. Mark's in Venice. The spatial effect must have been eerie and overpowering, something that is difficult to reproduce in today's modern concert halls. To learn more about 15th and 16th century music and the context of Renaissance art, we may refer you to the following sources. To learn more about Renaissance painting and sculpture, we may refer you to the following sources. To learn more about Renaissance architecture, we may refer you to the following sources. To learn more about Renaissance history, we may refer you to the following sources. To learn more about Renaissance writers, we may refer you to the following sources.